the importance of that and kind of give you jumping off points. Necessarily, this is a survey course, right? When we look at some of the diagrams and some of the information as to exactly how much history we're looking at here, there is no way we could cover it in 2 years, let alone 2 hours. So we're gonna engage in the dialogue. We're gonna point out a few doors, maybe open them a little crack, but it's going to be largely on you to follow up and walk through yourselves. Naturally, I'm here for the Q&A. But we'll look at the presentation. We got a kind of a PowerPoint style presentation that we'll do first. Once we complete the presentation, we'll kind of end the presentation and segue right into applying this to working in your current tradition, or at least in my current tradition. And then we'll do questions and answers. We'll do maybe a break in the middle. We have a nice tight crowd tonight, so we'll be able to be very flexible and flowing with it. Right, a couple things for you guys who are watching this live to note. Click on the screen. That's going to go ahead and bring up a few options for you. One of them is going to be Q&A. So when we get to the Q&A part, I'll be going through there to ask questions. You can ask questions in chat. I may or may not answer it, to be completely honest with you. If it scrolls out, I'm not going to see it. If I'm talking and kind of in my flow, I'm going to try to ignore chat. I may even close it out because I don't want it to disrupt me. So that Q&A feature kind of queues everything up, pun intended, lets us address it one at a time. It's pretty convenient for all of us. So I recommend you use that for sure. With that said, let me bring up the screen share here. Actually, let me start by kicking off the presentation. Go present. And let me share screen. There we go. And the presentation is what we're sharing. Boom. Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Paleotheology. As I said, we're talking about the magic and spirituality of the prehistoric era. Frankly, that subtitle is, I'm not satisfied with it. Because it's the everything, as we'll look at it, it's the everything of the prehistoric era. There weren't these distinctions between these things until very recently. Prior to the, Enlightenment, this age of reason, as they call it, which is only 500 years ago, 600 years ago. Even then, alchemy and chemistry were the same thing, right? It's the further back we go, the more entwined, the more singular the understanding is. And, for those of you who have taken my courses before, I speak in terms of models, right? We have models of things. There's no, reality is what it is. It doesn't have these neat categories and distinctions or anything like that. Everything is just the thing, I should say. We build these mental models. We create these distinctions, these categories, and that gives us a great deal of power. It gives us a great deal of ability to interact, a great deal of ability to distinguish and to communicate and to record across time. But as we go further back, as we go into prehistory, as we go into the age when things weren't recorded across time, okay, we reach an era, a mode of being, a mode of thinking, a paradigm, if you will, where these things aren't distinguished. There's just knowledge. It's the accrued knowledge of those who came before, of the ancestors. So I encourage you to kind of try to hold on to that mode of thinking rather than thinking of it as, oh, this is the magic and this is the spirituality and this is the religion, because it's natural for us to sort of fall into that trap. But the more we can take a singular view of this, as this is human knowledge, this is the knowledge of the ancestors, the more we will approximate the approach that our ancestors took. So let's dive into it. Part 0 here, a little bit of an introduction. For some of you, it's your first class with me, first time kind of interacting with me in person, so to speak. So a little bit about me we'll kick off with. As you probably know, I am oh, nice. We got some thunder outside here, which is a sign from the heavens that they approve of what we're about to do here. I'm the founding minister and prophet of Holy Mountain Spiritualist Temple. I'm a full-time spiritualist, conjurer, root worker, This is what I do for a living. I do the nitty gritty. Increasingly in the COVID era, I'm doing more teaching, more of these webinar type things. And as I'm transitioning now to focus a lot more on establishing the temple in the current time to provide that as something for people. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end as well. My background academically, from way back when I was a youngin', was in cultural anthropology, specifically with a focus on indigenous magico-religious practices. I had been exposed to the working tradition of what we call hoodoo, conjure, when I was much younger, in a variety of ways. I have been exposed to, through my own research and reading, a lot of these practices, and particularly to shamanism. And that led me, as I kind of wasn't originally going to go to college, but going to college full time to study cultural anthropology, specifically so I could have some, direction and license and guidance in learning this stuff, to get access to the libraries and the databases, because I wanted to learn about this. This was it for me. I have taken what I learned academically, and that has very much been my guide in my own spiritual studies, my own spiritual path, and my own practice. The fundamentals, the principles we're going to discuss tonight, and I'm happy to, give examples from my own work, or if you have questions or ask, they absolutely are applied in my day-to-day. And so that's why I said this is a foundational class, and it is something that is often overlooked for two reasons. One, it's not written, but it's necessarily not written down because it's prehistoric, right? So there's no canon text or anything like that. Two, it's so old that it is not distinct. At least we don't have it in a distinct way, right? We just have our ability to interpret it. So between those two things, there's no living tradition of it. So we're doing this archaeological work, this anthropological research in sort of resurrecting this tradition. So I originally became interested and specifically started pursuing ancient ways of relating to magic and spirituality in high school, thanks to two teachers. And it's because of these two teachers that I included two of the references that I did. The first was Dr. Robert Baker, who was my English teacher in junior high and high school. Dr. Baker was a really cool dude and put me on to Carlos Castaneda's The Teachings of Don Juan. When I discussed further with him, he put me on to Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell. And one of the books you have is Primitive Mythology by Campbell. This book is phenomenal for its breadth of studies. It doesn't look deeply into all cultures, but the cultures it looks into are very well chosen and very representative. And his ability to look across cultures and through cultures and to trace these threads through history is really phenomenal. The second book that you have is something that I came to through the reference of another teacher, Rabbi Kavan. As some of you know, I was educated in a full day school of Jewish studies, Hebrew studies, and things like that. So I, being me, was constantly asking the rabbis, "What's Kabbalah? Teach me about Kabbalah. I want to learn Kabbalah." All I knew is that it was Jewish magic. It wasn't. This isn't a course on Kabbalah, nor did that pay off for me. But when I asked Rabbi Kavan, "Teach me about Kabbalah," he said, "Why do you want to learn about Kabbalah?" And I said, "I'm interested in learning about magic." And he said, "Well, you just need to read one book. It's called The Golden Bough by Fraser." And so I picked up The Golden Bough as a very young man. This was about 7th grade, 5th grade. And it turned me off immediately. As I was saying before we started recording, Fraser is obviously a skeptic. He's casting judgment this entire time on the people he's talking to. And so I said, this guy doesn't know anything, because I was young and I knew everything. But as I returned to it in my college studies, and since then, it's a well. And we're going to look at some pages of it tonight. And again, you guys have access to that PDF version of it. So that's something that I cannot encourage you strongly enough to familiarize yourself with. And I'll get into why. So enough about me. Let's talk about the topic. What is paleotheology? So it doesn't mean anything. It's a term I made up. It describes the integrated prehistoric body of knowledge. As I said in the beginning, we have to remember that our ancestors did not have these neat little categories of this is science and this is religion and this is spirituality and this is sociology and this is anthropology and this is culture. They didn't. It was one thing. The elements that fascinate me about it are what I break down here, which is it is the fundamental religion, right? It is our core of beliefs and understandings regarding the spiritual started there, were passed down beginning then. It is the fundamental science, meaning our beliefs and our understandings regarding the material universe, how we relate to the material universe, cause and effect, all that. And finally, it's the fundamental culture. Our beliefs and understandings regarding the human, our place in the universe, our interaction with one another, right and proper conduct, all that starts from this first body of knowledge, right? I'm fascinated with the idea that, everything we have for today, we take for granted because there was a time, for most of the time of humans, okay, and we'll look at this stuff. For most of our history, the vast majority, we had none of it. None of it. Not clothing, not shelter, not light, not even fire. All these things became discovered after long, dark, animal-like periods. Even in these long, dark, animal-like periods, somehow we had the basis of religion. We had magic. Okay, we had an understanding of things that was much more integrated. The more we separate, the more we can interact with, the more we can command, the more we can encode into our realities. The more integrated we become, the more we lose control over those things. And as humans, in order to become masters of this world, as at some point became our ambition, we had to create all these categories, all this stuff. Back then, back in our ancestral times, though, this body of knowledge was just what the knowledgeable people knew. It was derived from firsthand experience, from trial and error, and from application and passing down the successful application, because much like everything to do with our species at that time, the shit that didn't work got you killed, and then you didn't pass it down. So why does paleotheology matter today? We've come a long way. As we've said, we've got spiritual technologies have been developed quite progressively, but are all based on the same principles. And theology, religion, has clearly progressed. First, it is a direct connection to the spiritual life of our ancestors. Okay, we've talked a lot in these classes, a lot in this series about the importance of working with our ancestors, connecting with our ancestors, drawing upon our ancestors, embodying our ancestors. We've talked about how important it is to draw on their spiritual deposits that they've made for you, to withdraw those accounts, to claim your spiritual birthright. Well, again, for most of human history, this is the sort of practices we're talking about. For most of our ancestors, this is the birthright they've left for you. Is it all civilized? Most assuredly, it is not. Is it powerful? Indeed. Secondly, the roots of the archetypes and the innate forms of culture and the ancestral mind are all here. The things that we've built our imaginations around were all forged back then. Why? Because for the most part, what we see in these early stages where they haven't been encoded and mystified are pretty successful attempts to motivate the species by giving an explanation for the mysteries. We'll take a look a little later at the types of mysteries that we're talking about. Finally, it's the foundations of our whole moral and ethical life, laws, proceed from that. The ideas that we have about what's right and wrong start then. And if we want to understand in a time like the one we live in now, how to separate right from wrong, how to perform cultural alchemy, this is essential. Finally, this is the magic of absolute necessity. I speak a lot about folk magic as the magic of pragmatism, the magic of necessity, right? You don't come to these things by way of theory. You come to these ways by way of sudden, desperate inspiration. This is the magic that our ancestors created and practiced in order to survive in a world where there was nothing to assist them in that. No medical care besides what you could grab from the bush if you recognize the flora and fauna and had that cultural knowledge at that point. Certainly for most of our history, they did not. Created and practiced. Plant lore is old, but it is not that old. We'll look at that. They did not have even a basic, no one to teach them or guide them on how things happen. No physics other than what you figured out or what you were shown. There was no way to encode knowledge when we go far enough back. We'll talk a little bit about the problems of historicity, as it's called, and the placing too much significance on the historic as well. And we'll talk about how just because something wasn't written down doesn't mean it wasn't passed down in a durable way. So we'll look at some of that. Okay, part one. This is a crash course in ancient human history because for some reason or another, this isn't something we think about or talk about all the time. We hardly know history more than a few hundred years ago. We'll see that is just the smallest drop in the bucket when it comes to this well of history. Let's start with the definition. What does prehistoric mean? Prehistoric literally means before recorded history. Right? Before, historic, the age that is written down in the histories. So we naturally want to ask, how old is recorded history? How old is that? So the earliest proto-writing, what we call proto-writing, which is not quite hieroglyphics, but are not quite drawings, it's about 12,000 BC. It's pretty old, about 14,000 years ago. That's way longer than our whole civilization. It's longer than history for sure. We're into the prehistoric at that point, you see. But the oldest written human records, different than just like a few markings here and there, but this appears to be like a record, something of substance with a lot of characters. For that, we got to wait a long time, until about 3,500 BC. Those still, they're not what we call coherent. We'll talk briefly here about one of the problems of historicity. What was coherent to people at the time and what is coherent to the people now is two completely different things. And so we can maybe use that 3,500 date. Normally we talk about recorded history beginning around 2,500 BC. That's the one we're going to go with. Does that matter if 1,000 years really matter? When we look at the next slide, I think you're going to agree with me. It certainly does not. I want to take another moment here to talk about historicity. The Western European bias in historicity that has infected and affected our entire study of history in this context, right here in this country, and in the context of academia. We know that even now, cultures encode knowledge in a lot of ways. Writing is one way of doing it. It's a very effective way of doing it. Drawing actually can be a much more effective way. As we know, a picture's worth 1,000 words. A crudely drawn picture may only be worth 100, but I have two little kids, a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old, and one of them was able to, communicate to me they had a bellyache by drawing a little stick figure with a red tummy. If you were to write that out in words, it would have taken her a lot longer. Right? I was on the phone. She needed to show me that. So we can communicate a lot without writing. And so writing, especially when we go to these older ages where our medium, the thing we create on, is stone. Okay, writing is a pretty inefficient thing because on the one hand, you may need a lot of ink, which is hard prized to get. You know how many berries you need to go through to make enough ink to paint a square this big? Try it. On the other hand, you're chiseling into stone. And to do that requires a lot of physical work. So things were always encoded and passed down in a most efficient way. Now, we've turned the corner in that, right? We can now type extremely fast and store things indefinitely with a relatively little amount of energy. So now we found a really efficient way to communicate in writing. So that's really good too. But the middle period, the painstaking writing everything by hand period, that whole period was very specialized. The creation of any written document for a very long time was a highly specialized skill held to a certain class of scribes. You know, not even the king could necessarily write, and certainly the farmer couldn't. They could make agricultural marks to write receipts and things like that. They had tallies, symbols, things that look like sigils to us now. But writing, the command of language that we take completely for granted in the written form, is only about 4,500, 5,000 years old. And again, that's a long time. Granted, it's more than any of us is going to live. We certainly can't call ancestors that far back. But I say only because of what we're about to see here. And I'm going to introduce a notation here that I just mentioned, right? So we talk about recorded history begins around 2500 BC. That's 4,500 years ago, 4,520 years ago. But we'll call it 4,500 just for simplicity. So when we talk about these ancient periods, we're talking about, we use this notation we see here, the KBP. So 4,500 years is 4.5 KBP. KBP stands for 1,000 years before present. The K stands for 1,000 years, and then BP stands for before present. So 4.5 KBP is where we have recorded history from. So I'm actually going to pull up chat again real here to make sure that we're understanding the KBP concept and give you guys pop quiz for the chat. So using the KBP, how long ago was the time of Christ? How many KBP ago was the time of Christ? Whoever wants to answer in chat will win a prize. Let's say you will win a 3-card reading from me for the first person. About 2.5. Close. 2. Marcelo, you got a 3-card reading. Thanks, my friend. 2 KBP ago, exactly. So now you guys got the idea. It's KBP kind of saves us a lot of zeros, which gets confusing. You'll see in a second here. Oops, click the wrong button again. Okay. So we'll go to the next slide and talk about what we're talking about. Okay. So here's a little KBP chart for us. Whoops. Boop, boop. Okay, so let's put that in context. Down here at the bottom of our chart, 2 KBP, the Gospels. 0.6 KBP before that is the Hebrew Torah. 1.9 KBP before that is the beginning of recorded history. So we already know that the Torah, which is like the Old Testament, is only about halfway back through recorded history. There's whole half of recorded history before that the Torah was based upon and draws upon, intentionally or unintentionally, as we'll see and as we'll discuss, because culture is a progressive thing, because no culture occurs in a vacuum. About 1 KBP, so 1,000 years before that we have that proto-cuneiform, proto-hieroglyphic language.
Intentionally or unintentionally.
Things were being indicated,
because
whether they
cultures are
would be
progressive.
broadly
no culture
understood
occurs in a
or
vacuum.
for whom they were being recorded is unclear. Likely they
About
were
10
recorded primarily between the person and the
Sorry,
spirit.
about 1 kbp. So so 1,000
We can go
years.
4.5 kbp,
Proto-cuneiform.
4,500 years before that. And we have, again, the earliest proto-writings, marking on cave walls, things commemorating or indicating something. Very, no one in
between the
no
person-
contemporaries
sorry, about
now
1 kbp.
can honestly say they know what it
means. So
means. Okay,
1,000
we can go. So
years.
we've gone
4.5
from
kbp.
2 kbp ago, which was the time of Jesus,
Before that,
to
we have,
10
again, the
kbp
earliest
ago.
proto
So
writings, marking on
5
cave
times
walls.
back from the time of Jesus, we get to the earliest writing. So take that 3 times back. Okay, we're going back now 30,000